shout out to the group from the Center for Private Equity and Venture Capital as well. This is going to be somewhat of a cross-functional or cross-center presentation. But so what we're talking about today is essentially the future of B2B product marketing, which could also easily have been titled the future of B2B software, because these two topics, as I'll get into, are incredibly close to each other, and sort of there are forces on both sides that are kind of simultaneously shaping both the market itself and the roles within the market. But this kind of eBook project essentially came from a couple places. One is my own background as a B2B product marketer prior to Tuck, and two is actually kind of started with an independent study I did with Professor Taylor back in the spring, where I basically realized if you're interested in something, the kind of best way to learn about it is to try to teach yourself enough about it and talk to enough smart people about it that you can yourself write about it. So, the fundamental question that I started with is, what will B2B product marketing look like in 5 years? And I picked B2B specifically because something like 75% of the people who have the title product marketer in their job description work in B2B software. You'll see product marketers in B2C, and you'll see them in kind of other fields, but they're pretty concentrated in this space. Product marketing is a bit of a unique field in that in most software companies, it essentially sits in the middle of a sort of three-part Venn diagram between product management, sales, and traditional corporate marketing. Increasingly, you can potentially throw customer success into one of those bubbles as well. But it is this role that is simultaneously concentrated in the B2B SaaS space, but is also vastly cross-functional, and it's changed considerably. And probably out of just my own curiosity and my own self-interest, I started thinking, okay, what's the best way to research this? Let me go out and interview CMOs, marketing leaders, and product marketing experts from kind of the most interesting B2B software companies at every stage, everything from high-flying Series A all the way through Salesforce and some of the biggest companies in the world. And so I ended up going out and interviewing 23 leaders, which I dubbed guides for the kind of positioning of this ebook, including some great Tuck alums. Leela's CMO of SurveyMonkey has had this incredible career. She was the first actual product marketer at LinkedIn, leads a team of about 250 marketers at SurveyMonkey now. Talked to folks like Camille Ricketts, who's head of brand at Notion, which is probably pound for pound the kind of hottest Series B, Series C, B2B company in the market today. And then folks who are kind of deep sort of thinkers and writers on product marketing themselves. People like Marcus Andrews, who's formerly at HubSpot, now at Pendo, does an incredible podcast on product marketing. And so essentially went out, interviewed this large group of experts, did a bunch of secondary research, kind of based on my own experience and a sort of ton of writing that's been done on where the B2B software market itself is going, brought these kind of two collections of information together into this short, and when I say short, it's 71 pages, but it could have been much longer. So this is truly the concise version ebook that is built kind of not only to answer this question of where is product marketing going in the next 5 years, but is really built for two audiences. One, kind of early career PMMs who are trying to figure out their way through the space and figure out what their careers are going to look for in the future. And two, leaders at B2B software companies that are trying to figure out, how much should I invest in product marketing? Is this a field that's critical for my company to succeed? Kind of what is this thing that seems like it borrows from a ton of different other fields? So that's how the ebook came together. The first step, and this is, I think, something we don't do in the tech industry enough, however, was to ask the question, where did B2B product marketing come from in the first place? Like, why does this role exist? why don't product marketers go out, or product managers go out and do, their own market research? Why doesn't sales like figure out its own positioning and talk tracks? Why doesn't corporate marketing, just work on messaging themselves? Why do you need this kind of specialized group that sits between these different functions? And the first thing that I found out, this is a great quote from Ravi Miara, who was an early PMM at Akamai back before they, back when they were, a tiny startup. Now he's product marketing at a developer security company called Sneak. We basically said, like, if you go back to the 90s, you rarely heard about product marketing. You had, the kind of parts of the role that some people specialized in, but you really didn't hear about dedicated PMMs until the early 2000s in a big way. And there were a couple reasons for this. The big one is that if you basically go back to the enterprise software space in the 80s and 90s, you would see kind of a couple things. One is that compared to today, competition was relatively low. It was just harder to build software. It was more expensive. It was all on premises, which means it was harder to change. And the barriers to entry to the software space were relatively high. And this created a world where you could essentially, from a marketing perspective, use large brand marketing campaigns that weren't terribly well targeted. You didn't need to update your customers on kind of new features and functionality nearly as often. And you could essentially basically rely on sales was in a less competitive environment. And so you didn't need, folks specializing on sales enablement. And this created a world where there just wasn't a demand for dedicated PMMs. What happens in the early 2000s is essentially the Sas Revolution. So software moves from on-premises to starting to be in the cloud. And you have a couple kind of forces that come with that. One, the market starts to get a lot more competitive because all of a sudden it's cheaper to build software. Two, software, because it's easier to launch features, starts to get much more specific, starts to target sort of smaller and smaller verticals. And this creates a world where all of a sudden turning to your product managers and saying, hey, I need you to launch, new features every quarter. I also need you to tell me where the market's going to be in 2 years. I also need to write your own positioning. And I also need you to go teach the sales team how to sell it, becomes just way too much for any one function to take on. And so the kind of rise of product marketing and why it exists is essentially because the cost of software development has gotten and will continue to get significantly cheaper. And the cost of growth in a more competitive world, essentially, blended customer acquisition cost, has continued to go up. And so in an environment where it's really easy to jump into the market and it's expensive to grow, you need people who are focused on this. And this was kind of fascinating because I had never, I essentially looked back and said, all right, these are the forces that created the role. What's going to happen in the future? Because these forces are going to continue to impact both the SaaS industry and product marketers in general. So from here, I essentially said, all right, if you talk to people who are much smarter about the space than I, what are these sort of big macro trends that are going to influence B2B software, and in so doing, influence the environment that product marketers are working in? And so the first one is not surprising. The trends we've seen for the last 20 years are going to continue. We're going to live in a world 5 years from now where cheaper development and even more expensive growth are going to drive absolutely cutthroat competition. And I'm not talking about like, oh, just go, raise a few more venture dollars or, brush up your marketing a little faster. I'm talking about sort of verticals that rise, kind of fall and consolidate much, much faster than they do today even. And there are sort of 3 predictions for product marketers that come out of this world where competition is just absolutely brutal. The first is that in a world where months, and in some cases even weeks, can mean the difference between launching a feature or a product that allows you to define a category and win a vertical and having you become sort of an also-ran. Product marketers will have to learn about their customers and the market they're in significantly faster than they do today. And that in many teams, I think, will mean two things. One is getting much better at taking in and synthesizing customer data quickly and designing the tools and infrastructure to do that. And two is going right to the source and actually hiring people who have been customers or who have similar personas to your customers. So, two kind of really interesting factoids here. So one, there's this great research that the Product Marketing Alliance did on roughly 206 tools, I think it was, in 15 different categories that product marketers use in their daily work. With the exception of competitive intel tools, literally none of these categories are categories where product marketers are the primary decision maker. So within SaaS companies, product marketers are almost always piggybacking on tools that are purchased by other teams, sales, product, whatever, and are often designed for the needs of those other teams. So in the future, if PMs want to be able to move faster and learn about their markets faster, they're going to have more of a seat at the table in terms of purchasing the software that delivers customer data. The second piece, I talked to a product marketing leader at Datadog, which is a developer security company. And he basically said, yeah, like several years ago, we just stopped hiring marketers and we just started hiring customers and teaching them how to market, because it's much easier to take somebody who's been a security expert, been a developer inside of a company, teach them how to write positioning, than it is to take somebody who's sort of a non-technical marketer and teach them how to speak to developers. And I think that's a trend that will continue. So second prediction is that in a world where it is relatively cheap and easy to copy new features and new products, brand all of a sudden becomes much, much more important. There's a great talk, and I freaking reference this talk all the time, but it's brilliant, that Patrick did with David Cancel, who's CEO, Drift, former chief product officer at HubSpot, like fundamentally a product guy, where he basically said, like, yeah, you can launch a great feature and yeah, it'll give you a couple months head start, but HubSpot has a ton of engineers. They're not dumb. The feature is, chances are there's nothing proprietary about it, and they're going to come and copy you, or Salesforce or Google, whoever it happens to be. And so in that type of environment, features and products aren't going to be able to win on their own. In fact, they're going to be like relatively commoditized in many situations. And what's going to differentiate software companies is having a brand that speaks really specifically to the needs of your customers. And a brand that not only speaks to the needs of your customers, but that also can convince your customers that your product is different in a world where it probably isn't that different. And so that's why the kind of prediction ends with saying product marketers, who are the marketers that understand product the best, who are the marketers who also understand customers the best, I think are likely to take more ownership over brand in the future. The last prediction, I think, is perhaps not surprising, and that is in a world where essentially the market is moving significantly faster than it does today, what have traditionally been for product marketers these sort of like once in a year or two strategic projects, things like big repositionings or like completely revamping your messaging stack, or sort of trying to recategorize your company, saying, hey, we used to do X, but now we're really Y. These things will move from being sort of big strategic projects that you do every 18 months to being things you may do every 3 months or every quarter, simply because sort of staying ahead of competitors will require kind of constant refining and constant updating of your messaging and positioning at a pace that's kind of unheard of today. So the next macro trend is one that could truly have written an entire book on, but that is the idea that in the future, customers will demand increasingly flexible, customizable SaaS products that don't require them to go to engineers or their internal IT teams to change. There are, today we essentially categorize these as low code, no code products. So think of Airtable, think of Notion, think of UiPath and kind of products that get more into like the workflow and RPA world. The sort of prediction here is essentially that in the future, low code, no code will not be a separate category. It will essentially be the way users expect to interact with SaaS products. Users will expect to be sort of drag and drop functionality. They'll expect to be able to take a product that they bought for sort of use case A and quickly update it to deal with use case B. So the way I sort of categorize it in the book is people will move from, buying action figures that essentially just do the thing you buy, one thing you buy them for, to buying Legos, where like, yeah, you can build a Lego action figure, but you can also break it down and build something else and continue to shape it based on your needs. So in this kind of highly flexible world, I think there are sort of two predictions for how this will impact product marketers. One is that product marketers will shift from teaching users what a product does in a static way, like here is what the product does, here is how you use it, to teaching users what they can build with a product. So if you look at a product like Airtable, which is, I think, candidly, like one of the hardest product marketing jobs out there because there's so much that it can do, and you look at their website and a lot of their messaging, it's all about here's what you can build using Airtable. It's not about here's what Airtable does. So they're not selling it as, oh, it's a replacement for a spreadsheet, or oh, it's something you can use to link different apps together. They're basically selling a tool rather than or basically selling like a kit almost rather than a static tool. And so in this world, product marketers will have to be much more upfront about educating users around how to use a product, basically educating users on what they can build with a product, than simply telling users, hey, here's the product functionality, kind of sign up and start using it. I think kind of change here is that teaching users what they can build with your product, while also like anchoring your product in the best use cases for it, will be a really interesting balance. And that brings me to my next prediction, which is that the use cases that define who uses products, who buys them, and sort of how they develop in the future will increasingly be user generated. So instead of me going out and saying, I've built this product, here are the 3 best ways to use it, and I'm going to sell them to 3 personas that have this need, you're increasingly going to have really flexible products where product marketers, yeah, they may understand some of the core use cases when they launch a product, but in a couple months, they'll sit there and say, hey, actually, here are 3 other use cases that we didn't even anticipate. We're seeing these 3 personas that we didn't think about 3 months ago using them. We need to integrate that into the way we bring our product to market. Notion, I think, is an interesting example here. So when they launched, they essentially, basically the way they defined their initial core use cases was not going out and doing a bunch of customer interviews or sort of sitting down and having a strategy discussion about what are the most valuable places we can place this. They literally like launched the product to their beta group and just saw who was using it and how. Then they took the top 3 use cases, the top 3 persona or the top personas for each one, and that's kind of been their positioning for the last several years. They also have this large long tail of use cases where they'll essentially see kind of new uses for the product bubble up. They'll move that into their main positioning, but it's largely user driven rather than just having like a bunch of PMMs and salespeople in a room, deciding like what we think this product is useful for. The last trend, and I will go through this quickly because there's a lot here. I'll hit some of the highlights, is the idea that product-led growth, while not every SaaS company will necessarily have a product-led growth strategy. And by product-led growth, we basically mean a go-to-market strategy in which the first touch point for the majority of your users is simply coming to your website and signing up for your product. It's not talking to a sales rep. It's not going through a demo and a large implementation process. It's literally the way most of us found Slack or Zoom or Calendly. But my prediction is essentially that partially because product-led growth companies just perform better, partially because they generate much more reliable data on who's using the product and why, PLG will basically become the default go-to-market strategy for many software companies. And even those that are sales-led and that remain sales-led for good reason are going to have a really strong answer for why they're not pursuing a PLG strategy. Which is why I say, like, even the sales-led ones are going to be influenced by product-led growth in some ways. So a couple ways that this impacts product marketers. One is that in a world where product-led growth companies seek to acquire end users, so people like us who just want to talk to my team or just want to make my calendar easier to use, rather than going to a senior leader, selling them on some kind of large enterprise deal and having that product pushed down. In a world where you're targeting end users, B2B product marketers will have to learn skills that are traditionally associated with B2C. So the way, one of us goes onto the Apple App Store, downloads Instagram and starts to use it, that sort of messaging and that flow will influence B2B much more strongly in the future, especially in a world where you can't just rely on sales to go out and sell for you. I think it's kind of no surprise that in a world where sales teams still exist, but they are either working further down the funnel, kind of once a product has acquired a bunch of end users within a company, having sales come in to sign a larger deal, or a world where sales is only working on like your very, very largest accounts and everything else is product led. It's no surprise that product marketers will move closer to product management, partially because I think product managers and product marketers in the future will basically have joint kind of responsibility over the funnel that brings people into your product, gets them onboarded and activated, and gets them to see value and retain your product in the future. This is one I could talk for a very long time about, but I will go quickly for it. So one of the kind of traditional issues with product marketing is that it is because it's so cross-functional, it's really hard to manage. If you think about, a sales deck that a PMM makes, is that sales deck valuable because we have really good salespeople? Is it valuable because, the product marketer behind it is great? Is it, because it's so cross-functional, it's hard to measure. But in a world where essentially there is very little between product marketers and the end users that are hitting a website, coming in and signing up for a product, the impact of things like changing messaging and positioning will be much faster and much easier to measure than a world where that customer behavior has to filter through sales, other marketing campaigns, and kind of all this different, kind of a much more complex process. One of the really, I think, interesting things that came out talking to a couple product marketing leaders at companies where they have sort of just transitioned from acquiring a bunch of end users to now getting to a point where it makes sense to go out and use those end users to sell big enterprise deals. So that point where you go to a company and say, hey, 1,000 of your people are using our product on like individual accounts. I think it makes sense to sign an enterprise deal now. A unique change will be, in the past, PMMs essentially created messaging for like one simple group of buyers. It was like, I sell to chief security officers, I sell to CMOs, I sell to VPs of sales. My messaging is entirely for them. I don't really care about anybody else. In a world where you first have to message to end users and then level up to senior executives after you've got a certain critical mass, the messaging that PMMs create will be sort of multi-level, and it will be decentralized in that you may want to say something different to an end user that like clicks on a LinkedIn ad and comes to your product than to a senior executive that is thinking about, all right, how does this product change things for my company at a strategic level? Last one we'll talk about is essentially the line between product marketing and growth marketing. Traditionally, growth marketing has been much more experimentation based, much more kind of quantitative. It's been all about like sort of small optimizations for how can we get, another 2 or 3% of people to, convert into our product or to use a certain feature. In a world where growth marketers and product marketers are paying attention to like the same product driven funnel, I think the skill sets between those two groups will start to converge. So product marketers will have to get much more quantitative and get much more kind of comfortable with experimentation. And growth marketers will have to start paying attention to things like language and messaging and customer personas more than they do today, partially because they won't be able to just assume that if someone's using the product, they're the right user. So you'll notice the title says 11 predictions, and we've only talked about 10. That is because there is a whole section at the end, which is about things that won't change, which I actually think is quite important. I think core of product marketing, which is that it tends to attract people who are interested in these sort of double trade-off of, one, helping companies understand their customers, and two, helping customers understand companies. I think the best product marketers tend to be those who are kind of empathetic, data-driven, but also creative enough to understand kind of how to get people to behave in ways they don't necessarily expect. I think that aspect of product marketing and many of the experts I talk to is unlikely to change. So if you are interested in reading the book, it actually launched last week in partnership with the Product Marketing Alliance. So I know Joe and Patrick sent out a note, and you can also search for it on the PMA website. And I also recently did a podcast with them that dives a little deeper into some of the findings of the book. So if you're looking for a beach read this summer, or you're so inspired by this talk, you want to go read more about product marketing, the book is there, and there's also a lot of easy ways to go through it that do not involve 70 pages. So there's a nice little summary at the top and all that good stuff. So thanks for listening.
Alex, fantastic. Really interesting topic. I think you and I have in the center have had this conversation going on for about over a year now, I think, is when we first started talking pretty in depth about this stuff. It's really been fun to watch your journey, and your kind of publishing these two now two great kind of resources for product marketers. As you think about product and product marketing and sort of the changes that are afoot, one of the things that comes to mind is, where is the P&L going to lie? Do you have a take on that, of like, how much more will product marketers? I've heard some tech companies that are really starting to assign P&L responsibility to product marketers, which is really interesting when you think about it. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, so that was one of the questions that I asked of everyone, basically, was, how do you measure product marketing at your organization? And there are two schools of thought, and one of them is winning. The sort of traditional school of thought, also depends somewhat on the stage of the company, is, look, product marketing is so cross-functional, it is so broad that you cannot possibly measure product marketing on something as simple as revenue. There's salespeople in there, there are other marketers, product marketers are this sort of special breed where it's much more like, do other teams think we're doing a good job? Does the market respond to our messaging than any one metric? I would say that's probably 30% of the people I talk to. The other 70% said there is one way to measure product marketers, and that's revenue. And their thinking behind that is, look, if sales, revenue is not where you want it to be, you're a product marketer, jump in the boat with sales, figure out what's going on, hey, figure out, is it a messaging issue? Is it a product issue? Basically the idea being that having revenue responsibility as a product marketer makes you much more proactive and much more aligned with other teams. I can tell you, especially in product-led growth companies, that same thought process is coming to product management. So anyone that wants to go into product because they think it's all about thinking great thoughts and selling, they have quotas, I don't want to do that. It's I guarantee you, in 5 years at a lot of companies, PMMs, product managers, sales reps, and potentially a lot of marketers will essentially have some form of performance-based comp and revenue-based kind of performance measurement.
That's my take too. That's what I'm hearing from companies that are kind of already thinking in that terms, that they're starting to put skin in the game for the product owners.
And it'll be interesting because I think there is a there is an argument for, like, you do need people who are thinking about not just next quarter, but, you know, next year, 2 years, 3 years from now. And, you know, you can make an argument that, like, I've seen this as well. Like, there are, you know, friends of mine in sales that I love that, like, if they can sell something, they're going to sell it. But just because you can sell it now doesn't mean it's strategically right for our company. So I think there'll be some sort of back and forth around, like, does it make sense to insulate PMMs a little bit? You know, should product folks, you know, on some things be able to take more speculative long-term bets? But yeah, I think we're moving towards much more revenue kind of alignment.
And to your point, I think the maturity of the company plays a significant role there, pre-IPO,
Totally.
post, you know, venture backed or not. All right, let's see. Looks like Roderick Milligan, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Raj.
Yeah, thanks again, Alex. And great presentation. I had a question about, like, you know, traditional marketers coming from CPG companies and transitioning into tech, and these tech companies. Like, do you see them adding value to this new software tech companies that, yes, it's fast to come up with new innovative ideas and roll them out, but it's becoming a lot more sticky with the brand, and they have a lot of experience in brand loyalty?
Rod, I think you're spot on. You were absolutely spot on. So if you had asked me, and, like, I love my friends in CPG, I think, like, I consider what I do almost like a hobby. What they do, like, that's real marketing. Like, you're like P&G and Coke, like that's like real marketing. But in all seriousness, if you'd asked me basically 2 years ago, I would have said, you know, I don't think it's a great fit, just because those large CPG markets move historically much more slowly. I mean, they develop products over these very long cycles. You know, they're thinking about, like, long-term demographic shifts. They rarely launch things that are, like, truly high growth. Today, I would actually say something very different, and that is, I think CPG marketers do, just by training, two things incredibly well. One is they're super comfortable with huge amounts of consumer data. And in a world where you can have a B2B product like Zoom, but you're literally thinking about, probably at this point, hundreds of millions, you know, tens of millions of users individually, that fits right into the sort of CPG playbook. I think the second thing, as you said, CPG folks are, like, masters of brand. And historically, like, the best brand builders in the world have been in consumer products and CPG, and B2B was this kind of like, yeah, we have brands, but they're not, like, no, you know, if you think of Coca-Cola and Oracle, you know, like one of them has, you know, brand plays a much bigger role. And I think, but in a world where brand is much more important, I think people who are really smart about that, yeah, a lot of them will come from CPG or B2C tech.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alex.
Other questions for Alex? I always throw in the jokes about pro golfers and enterprise software companies sponsoring golfers.
Oh yeah, if you ever fly through LAX, actually several other airports, you'll notice that for a long time Zoom sponsored the bottom of the TSA security bins, and I'd be very curious to know, like, how well that converts. But anyway,
Arlene.
Thanks, Alex. I feel like I'm looking into a lot of product marketing roles now, and as someone with more traditional marketing experience, I'm like, oh man, maybe I'll be jobless for a while. But just kidding, just kidding. Okay, so I thought it was really interesting what you said about how, like, consumers become the marketer, and that, like, feeds a cycle of, like, the consumers know best of what the marketers should be selling. How do you think that cycle? Can you help me understand that cycle a little more? Because I know, like, from a product marketing perspective, from my understanding, I feel like people always talk about, like, the product folks anticipating what consumers want, right? Like, Apple gives us what we want before we know we want it. So how does that work when the marketers are in this mindset of just creating what already exists?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would answer this with an example. So I don't know how many folks here have used Notion, but it is essentially a, like, all-in-one workspace for everything, kind of a knowledge base for everything. And sort of takes functionality that you would see in like everything from Google Docs to Microsoft Word to spreadsheets, and sort of brings it all together in this one kind of easy to use package. The sort of genesis of that product was Notion's team, and a combination of their product people and their marketers, essentially realized there was this really big but somewhat generalized problem with teams storing stuff across like all these highly fractured platforms. So I think if you've ever worked at, people have things like in their email, some things are on, Google Drive, some things are like just stored on someone's desktop, and it's this horrible problem. So in that case, Notion, saw a real customer issue, but it was this really general one. They then build this product that sort of brings all of that knowledge together. But it's really difficult to like roll up to someone and say, I'm going to sell you something that just replaces all of your productivity tools. Like, you have to get much more specific about use cases, or else you'll just never gain any traction. And so to get to those specific use cases, they basically got kind of a group of beta testers across folks they thought would be their primary customers. So, different kind of types of companies. And after a few months, they started to see 3 use cases that accounted for like 80% of the use of their product. So one was just note taking, the other was sort of internal wikis, and the third was basically spreadsheet replacement. And they then decided, and they saw, one of those use cases tended to be tied to like product teams. One of them tended to be tied to kind of finance and accounting teams, and the other tended to be tied to HR. And so there, I think the role of their team and their marketers was finding this really valuable problem of like, people are storing stuff everywhere and it's really confusing. But what their users did was surface these sort of gateway use cases that like someone comes in and they start using it for internal wiki, and then they're like, oh wow, this could be used for note taking, or this could be used to replace spreadsheets, or so the company had to identify the problem, but it was the users that identified these sort of ways in which that problem manifested itself most acutely, if that makes sense. And they could have done it the other way, right? They could have built a product and then said, hey, we think this is going to be really useful for internal wiki. Let's go out and sell this. And they may have gotten it right. They also may have gotten it badly wrong and had it take like multiple cycles for them to get to that same point.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like, just to try and combine like what we heard from Elise yesterday, Microsoft should be hiring their customers and just figuring out how everyone can exist in one ecosystem in a way that actually is productive for everyone, and we're not checking 20 bajillion things. Strong believer in Yammer. Just kidding.
But I think it's a really good point, Arlene, right? Because again, if we go back to, at least for those that weren't on that call yesterday, thinking about how do we sunset software that isn't actually making us productive, as opposed to this solution that Notion has, which I think has been really successful, which is like, well, we'll just consolidate, just keep using the kitchen sink method of everything, and we'll just find then a secondary layer of software to build on top of it, as opposed to like forcing organizations to say, actually, we're gonna edit and remove software. To me, that seems like a really interesting way to avoid political confrontations over which software wins inside enterprises, but not necessarily an efficient one.
Yeah, and there's this great, I forget who said this, but there's this great quote, I think it was from an investor, who basically said, like, the first question I ask any enterprise software pitch is, what spreadsheet do you replace? And if you sort of reverse engineer that, it means that if you create a spreadsheet replacement like Airtable, it should be an incredibly valuable company. I think it'll be really interesting in the future to see, especially as you look at this is like a very simplistic way to describe them, but you look at Salesforce, it's essentially just a big relational database with a bunch of like field entry, kind of workflows on top of it.
And workflows.
And it obviously there are a bunch of other reasons to use it, but yeah, I think it'll be an interesting question in the future as to where, I could see a world where you have like 80% of what a company does is handled by a small number of really flexible, really generalist tools, and then a really high value, like 20% of the work that has to be very specialized by industry, whether maybe it's for security needs or, because it has to, you're dealing with healthcare data or things like that, is going to be handled by more specialist platforms. But yeah, that'll be a really interesting thing to have play out.
It brings me back. Professor T and I were on a really great call with Simon Parmet, the former CEO of MuleSoft. He's talking about like, look, at the end of the day, it's now companies are now basically this robust data asset and human capital, and that no code idea that you referenced with David Cancel and that like software ebbing into the background is really where I think a lot of really forward-looking people are seeing the world headed, which actually in theory could do either a good job of eliminating, to Elise's project yesterday, eliminating a lot of the chaos, or create all sorts of new chaos as everyone builds their own tool, right? I mean, I don't know what it'll be, but I think her project paper really like highlighted the need to have a culture and a strategy to help solve some of these problems. Because product marketers out there are going to try to like sell you on. Right?
Yeah.
LG stuff, right? I mean, that's the danger of this.
Totally. And, it goes back to, I think there's sort of an interesting question as well, which is like, to what, in a world where software products can be used for all these different things, sort of what is the responsibility of product marketers, to train users on how to use that product most successfully, like to basically do user education, and B, kind of what is the responsibility of IT or, some kind of central office within an enterprise to provide guardrails on how to use it. So you don't end up with like, hey, we're all using the same software, but that software is so flexible that we're all using it in a million different ways, and we don't necessarily talk to each other, which just replicates the same problem. So, I think one thing I read about in the book is like, there are situations where product marketers like have the responsibility to say no to certain use cases, to say like, yeah, we understand 10% of people are trying to use our software this way, but that is not what we want, and here are the reasons.
Yeah. Alex, this has been great. Thanks everyone for sticking with us late. Really appreciate it. Really good, strong one to end on. We will have a presentation, I'm sure, later in the term from the team that's been working with Google. So look forward to that at a later date. And that project's doing really interesting things, and we look forward to that. But Alex, this is a great kind of wrap to our presentations this week, and really excited to kind of see your next book, whatever that is, right? We have to get the trilogy going, so we have to have the third book for the full trilogy.
Yeah, it's I need to find a more efficient way to dive into these things than 6-month book projects, but what better time to do that than now? So
exactly. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, these, as you heard, these are recorded. We will cut these up into individual presentations and post on the website later this spring, so that everyone can go back and kind of watch some of their favorite moments from the last couple nights and learn.
Alex.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good night.